In my speech, I want to cover three things. The work of the UK 2070 Commission on rebalancing or levelling up the economy, the role of planning in delivering this levelling up agenda, and my thoughts on the government's white paper on planning. Before I do this though, I did want, as a former head of the civil service, to register my serious concern about the recent resignation of Sir Jonathan Jones as the Treasury Solicitor, apparently due to his concerns over provisions in the government's internal market bill. Sir Jonathan was appointed to his role when I was head of the civil service, and is both a very able lawyer and a consummate professional. However, he would not have been willing to countenance breaching a legally binding agreement, even in specific and limited ways, and I have to say neither should the government. I hope that this can be put right during the passage of the bill through Parliament. Turning now to the UK 2070 Commission, it might seem odd during the COVID emergency for me to be talking about a commission into spatial inequalities that is consciously looking long game, looking back 50 years and forward 50 years, hence the title. However, for reasons I hope I'll make clear in my speech, it is indeed highly relevant that we think about these issues of spatial inequality, and in particular how they sit alongside the need for us to recover from the economic impact of this terrible virus. The Commission's first report was published in May of last year, and it provoked a considerable response. Yet the existence of regional inequalities was hardly new. What was striking about our report, I think, was the comprehensive evidence that we produced about the depth and direction of those inequalities, and the continuing economic and social consequences, and indeed political consequences for this country if we do not tackle those inequalities. The comparison work done by Professor Philip McCann at Sheffield University showed that on a basket of 28 indicators, the UK came 28th out of 30 countries in terms of spatial inequalities. And then building on that, the modelling work by Dr. Ying Jin at Cambridge University showed that on a high growth scenario, over half of the new jobs would go to London and the wider southeast, reinforcing and indeed increasing the level of inequality. Now, this might look like good news for the south, but the consequences of the growing imbalance are bad for everyone. In higher growth scenarios, we see increasing travel problems and congestion, higher levels of costs of housing, and growing environmental pressures. In a low growth scenario, some areas of the country even go backwards. So in short, everybody loses from this inequality. What particularly hit home in our report was the comparison with Germany, which seemed to have made much better progress, albeit not complete, in closing the gap between West and East following reunification. Let me just give you one further statistic from the Commission that captures the scale of the challenge. Jobs growth in London and the South East in the last 10 years has been more than twice the rate of the North, and that's a difference of 1 million jobs being created. Now, our final report was published on the 27th of February this year, just before coronavirus took over as the dominant news item. The focus of our final report was action. We set out a 10-point plan to reverse the trend in growing inequalities and to rebalance the UK. Let me just briefly summarise those 10 actions. Number 1, ensuring explicit spatial dimensions to the plans to get to zero carbon by 2050. we need that to be a just transition in every sense of that word. Number 2, delivering a transformed public transport network between cities, within cities, and beyond cities. Number 3, creating new networks of research and development excellence to complement the so-called Golden Triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. Number 4, strengthening the foundations of our local economies, tasking local leaders to produce inclusive growth plans. Number 5, recognising housing as part of our national infrastructure and planning now for the housing consequences of successful levelling up. Number 6, harnessing our cultural and environmental assets outside London, which receive disproportionately less money than London does. Number 7, devolving more powers and funding away from Whitehall. Number 8, developing a national plan to raise attainment and ensure that we have the skills for the future. Number 9, tripling the so-called Shared Prosperity Fund to 15 billion per annum, whilst ensuring fair access to those funds. And number 10, tasking the National Infrastructure Commission to produce a national spatial plan. We argued in our final report to achieve this scale of change required changes in the way we do things as well as what we do. And we set out in our report some changes in the way the governance of this country need to happen. We argued for a national outcomes framework, strong political leadership, and a powerful cross-departmental committee, as well as a dedicated national team working with those locally to deliver the Levelling Up programme across government. Now, in between the first and the final report, a new Conservative government was elected with a pledge to level up the country. We welcome that pledge as a commission, but we argued for it to have any practical effect, the government needed to have a large-scale, comprehensive and long-term plan. Anything less than this would raise expectations without delivering. In short, the government needed to go big or go home. Now, dealing with the challenges of Brexit and now coronavirus have undoubtedly had some impact on the government's capacity to prepare such a plan. But the need for a plan remains no less urgent. Indeed, it is essential for levelling up to be a meaningful concept at all. During the lockdown, the Commission has not stood still. We've produced 2 sets of think pieces, articles on different dimensions of the Levelling Up agenda. And we've also worked on a further report to explore in more depth the impact of COVID-19. We'll be publishing that later this autumn. The key point to be aware of from this is that a Levelling Up agenda is even more urgent if we're going to build our way out of the consequences of COVID-19. I'd like now to turn to the second of my themes, spatial planning. As I said earlier, one of the recommendations of our report was that England should have a national spatial plan as exists in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and indeed much of Europe. This would provide a vital context for decisions on infrastructure and development. And our ideas are very consistent with work done by Professor Cecilia Wong in Manchester. It also sits well with Nick Rainsford's report on planning for the TCPA. But we have gone further and set out a potential way forward. A national spatial plan for England should be prepared by a reconstituted National Planning and Infrastructure Commission, linked to the government's priorities and funding regimes, endorsed by Parliament, independently audited in a State of the Nation report, coordinated with the devolved administrations, integrated with subnational and departmental programmes, reviewed in line with parliamentary cycles, and be a material planning consideration. The national plan must be developed from the bottom up and not just imposed top down. It needs to be informed by, integrated with, and delivered through subnational strategies and devolved mechanisms. For me, this national plan should form part of a wider renaissance of spatial planning and urban development. In his final book, Good Cities, Better Lives, How Europe Discovered the Lost Art of Urbanism, Sir Peter Hall looked to our near neighbours in Europe to learn lessons about creating better places to live, work and play. It was published in 2014 at a time when local authority planning departments were suffering large cuts, often in the very capacity needed to deliver a creative planning process. It seems to me that at the heart of successful and sustainable European cities lies effective spatial planning and the powers and resources to see those plans through. Now, many of our inherited assumptions about transport, density, the role of town centres and home working will have to be rethought in the light of what we have learnt in responding to COVID-19. But the need for more effective spatial planning at all spatial levels remains as strong as ever. Above all, I want to see the planning profession as a creative profession, leading the work on spatial planning, not reduced to being a controlling profession focused only on development control. The current planning regime does need to move on from the over-engineered, under-resourced and litigious process that it has become. So reform is needed. But is the planning white paper the right answer? It's hard to argue with its aims. Who wouldn't want more beautiful developments on tree-lined streets, applauded by their local communities? The support for greater use of digital technology is welcome, as is the commitment to simplify the local plan process. But at the heart of the problem with the white paper is the belief that the planning process is the root cause of our failure to produce enough high-quality housing developments. This is despite copious evidence over many years, from the Lyons report to the Letwin report, that this is definitively not the case. As a consequence of this basic error, it proposes changes that in my view will have the opposite effect to that which the government intends. Let me just give you 3 examples of this. Firstly, the importance of genuinely affordable housing in boosting both supply and meeting an essential need is seriously underplayed. The proposal to move to a commuted sum rather than the negotiated provisions that we have at the moment risks reducing the level of affordable housing that is developed on sites. And that in turn risks the creation of monotenure estates. Replacing a negotiated sum with a fixed levy might look like simplification, but it will bring with it its own complexities and challenges. For example, getting the right level of levy in individual circumstances. Secondly, in my concerns, moving to a zonal, rules-based approach to planning approvals in growth areas rather than approving individual applications will drastically reduce local democratic engagement and potentially create greater rigidity. When individual schemes come forward, the public will not be happy to be told that their opportunity to comment and influence has already effectively passed. It will also reduce the scope for trade-offs that the current process allows. Alternately, we will end up with a zonal system that is honoured in the breach My third concern is that an imposed top-down figure for increased housing numbers will take us right back to the divisive, self-defeating debates of a decade ago. Grant Shapps was my first housing minister, and he could not have been clearer in his opposition to top-down targets. A decade on, he forms part of a government that is going exactly in this direction. Moreover, Lichfields have calculated that the extra 100,000 homes proposed will involve 90% of them being in London and the South East, which doesn't sit at all well with the levelling up agenda. I've given just 3 examples here, but there are many more. Above all, anyone who thinks that this will reduce the current complex, contested and litigious nature of the planning process in the high demand areas outside London is sadly mistaken. It will just move the place where the battles take place. Someone once said to me that they didn't mind people making new mistakes. It was the repeating of old mistakes that they objected to. The planning white paper is at best a missed opportunity, at worst a serious retrograde step. But let me finish on a positive note. There is now a common recognition across the political parties in the UK that we will not flourish without addressing levelling up. So we agree on the ends, if not yet on the means. The title of the final UK 2070 report was Make No Little Plans. It comes from Daniel Burnham, who took a leading role in the master plans for the development of a number of American cities. I'd like to draw on this quote a bit more. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir the blood, and probably themselves will not be realised. Make big plans. Aim high. Great ideas will never die, but live long with ever-growing urgency. If now is not the time for urgency and high ambition, then I'm not sure when it will be.